Multiple sources familiar with the interaction say the Premier's office has repeatedly contacted the Justice Minister's office in an attempt to influence cases. The CBC's Elise Von Shield joins me now from Calgary.
Good morning and salutations. This is Marcel Irnie, Irnieracing News. We got 11:19 a.m. January 27th. Today I'm doing a story on CBC News, and CBC did a story on Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, saying Alberta Premier Justice Minister's Office on COVID charges sources. And they're going on to say that Danielle Smith was contacting the Attorney General and putting pressure on him to essentially drop the charges, make the charges go away for all the COVID offenses, such as Pastor Arthur Pulaski.
We are reminding Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and the Alberta public and the entire world of the egregious human rights violations that happened during the coronavirus pandemic under Jason Kenney's direction. And those human rights violations are still happening today. Even though coronavirus restrictions are being rolled back, and even though the vaccine passport segregation is gone for now, and even though Alberta's healthcare workers are suddenly being told that maybe you don't need to get a vaccine that you don't want just to be able to do your job, we are reminding everyone that the Alberta government was one of the largest human rights abusers in the entire country, if not the entire world, through their attacks on churches and the arrests of pastors. And those human rights abuses continue to this very day. The man in the middle there, that's Pastor Art Pulaski. He's still in jail. He's actually the only person ever to be arrested and then charged and held under Alberta's Critical Infrastructure Defense Law. That law is designed to lock up pipeline saboteurs and wellhead bombers. But the Alberta government, under the direction of Jason Kenney, used it on a pastor who gave a sermon to truckers who were blockading the Coots border crossing, and those truckers were protesting against the remaining lockdown restrictions, and the blockaders were never charged under this critical infrastructure law. Just the pastor who told them to hold the line. He was arrested 5 times. Several of those were high-profile El Chapo-style takedowns on Calgary city streets. His crime, well, it started off by feeding the homeless on a bitterly cold Calgary day, much like today, what the province called an illegal public gathering. Then his crimes bled into not allowing his church services to be interrupted by public health inspectors to check for COVID compliance, and he refused to limit his congregation. Pastor Art was dragged through the Alberta court system. He was even issued a gag order, forced to renounce himself when he was found in contempt of a secret health court order. And now, Pastor Art Pulaski's languishing in jail. It's been 3 weeks. He's been denied jail like some kind of ISIS terrorist. His crime? Showing moral and religious support to people fighting the lockdown through peaceful civil disobedience at the border.
You know, people being attacked, vindicated. There are vindictive attacks on people standing up against these tyrannical measures. And so this piece is kind of about the CBC story and then the personal opinion. We'll take a look at the comments under CBC's video, which came out 1 day ago, 10,000 views. It's got 500 comments. So first I'm going to show you some of the story. Check it out.
We begin with breaking news from Alberta. CBC News has learned Premier Danielle Smith pressured the Attorney General and his office to intervene in COVID-related court cases. Multiple sources familiar with the interaction say the Premier's office has repeatedly contacted the Justice Minister's office in an attempt to influence cases. The CBC's Elise Von Shield joins me now from Calgary. Elise, walk us through your new reporting.
Yeah, so we were able to speak to people who were familiar with basically months of this going on, where the Premier would contact the Attorney General's office, inquiring about certain cases, specifically pandemic-related charges, but not only inquire, these people who we spoke to said that it went as far as to constitute pressure, that there was an expectation or an understanding communicated from the Premier to the Justice Minister's office that she wished for these pandemic-related charges, these COVID violations, to go away. And so the people who we spoke to who were familiar with what went on, with what had been said and spoken about, called it inappropriate. They called it constant and consistent pressure, and that was what the Attorney General was dealing with, and that in response to that, that his office was pushing back and saying, you know, I'm not sure that that's appropriate. I'm not sure what we can do here. So this was going on for a few months, ramped up in the last little bit, and had to do with a specific case as well, one of a pastor who was facing some criminal charges related to his participation in events surrounding the Coutts border blockade. So this particular case was one that, according to the sources that we spoke to, was one that Premier Smith wanted dealt with. She wanted it to go away. And there's an interesting connection, or a paper trail here, is that there had been public pressure from people who did not support pandemic measures, as well as from Rebel News founder Ezra Levant, who had sent a letter to the Premier's office specifically mentioning this case as well as other COVID cases, and essentially saying what he wanted her to do and offering her advice as to how she could get her Attorney General to step in here and get these charges to be dismissed or withdrawn. And so we were able to see a copy of this email that we then know was forwarded on to the Attorney General, so that there's little trails that we can follow here.
Trudeau's CBC state broadcaster just told me they're coming to smear Rebel News. This morning, they contacted me telling me they were going to publish an attack on us at 12 noon Alberta time today. They say they have a secret letter written by me to the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, and that they're going to publish a story about that letter at 12 noon. And do I have any explanations for it? Wow. Well, what would you do if a government journalist from Trudeau's CBC state broadcaster was trying to blackmail you with a gotcha story? Well, I think you'd probably do the obvious. You would publish the letter yourself first so everyone could see it in full. You'd call the CBC's bluff. So that's what I'm doing. You can see my letter to Danielle Smith right now at a website we've set up called lockdownamnesty.com. It's a 5-page letter that I sent to the Premier's Chief of Staff back in November after I had a chat with her in person.
Okay, I have the letter in front of me, dated October 25th, 2022. It's to Marshall from Ezra, and I'm just going to kind of get into the heart of it. Starting, the third paragraph. On the lockdown and pandemic prosecutions, I was heartened to see how well informed the Premier is on these matters, and that she clearly understands how important these issues are, both politically and morally. She really is on the right side of history. I see that just today, the New York Supreme Court reinstated all employees fired for being unvaccinated and ordered back pay. The Premier was interested in any information that I could provide her about the situation on the ground and the mechanisms available to her to provide leadership on these issues. The purpose of this note is to provide the Premier with that information. And then he goes on, existing cases. There are still an unknown number of tickets, charges, and contempt proceedings or related matters pending or proceeding that do not involve firearms or violence. I have good knowledge of many prosecutions that are being supported by the Democracy Fund or Rebel News, but other lawyers have filed as well, and some people who are charged would be self-represented. I cannot give you firm numbers, but I asked counsel, who I am working with, to compile a partial list of the prosecutors, which I hope to get to you this week. Some trials have commenced, and there are real issues about why they are proceeding. As the Premier says, they appear to have politically motivated. Staying or withdrawing the charges would send a strong message in support of the rule of law. I am only suggesting that the prosecutions would have been politically motivated, targeting people who are sought to exercise their constitutional freedom of expression and religion, be stayed or discontinued. From my knowledge of the prosecutions, most people charged were either attending a protest or religious gathering. Usually the people charged were the low-hanging fruit, the most vocal, or the ones sharing their message on social media. None of the prosecutions that the Democracy Fund or Rebel News supports have any violence or firearms involved. The Premier's actions on these prosecutions will promote democratic principles and ensure an appropriate use of our court's limited resources. And on my own note, very limited resources in the courts and by the police. The RCMP are understaffed by 30% these days. I read an article months ago. And yet a guy like Conrad Herbs has 3 hours to harass me over a parking warning. Okay, back to Ezra's story. Now he's talking about under jurisdiction. Almost all prosecutions that I'm aware of are being conducted by provincial prosecutors employed by the Alberta Crown Prosecution Service, so these matters are under Premier's jurisdiction. Page 2. The Attorney General, AG, has the discretion on whether and how to prosecute. Here is the leading case on the matter. So he's quoting, significantly, what is common on the various elements of prosecutorial discretion is that they involve the ultimate decisions as to whether a prosecution should be brought, continued, or ceased, and what the prosecution ought to be for. Put differently, prosecutorial discretion refers to the decisions regarding the nature and extent of the prosecution and the Attorney General's participation in it. Decisions that do not go to the nature and extent of the prosecution, i.e. the decisions that govern a Crown's prosecutor's tactics or conducts before the court, do not fall within the scope of prosecutorial discretion. Rather, such decisions are governed by the inherent jurisdiction of the court to control its own processes once the Attorney General has elected to enter into that forum. So end quote. Back to what he's writing. Specifically, the AG can decide the nature and extent of the prosecution and the AG's participation in it, and the Crown prosecutors employed by ACPS have prosecutorial discretion to stay or withdraw proceedings under the Criminal Code or Provincial Offences Procedure Act. As such, I expect that with the proper guidance and discretion from the Premier's office, the prosecutions related to the Coots protests, the non-violent cases without firearms, other anti-lockdown protests, and offences under the Public Health Act, which is prosecuted pursuant to the Provincial Offence Procedures Act, can all be withdrawn, stayed, or otherwise discontinued by the ACPS. The Crown prosecutors exercise this discretion regularly and are well versed in how to administratively direct a stay on proceedings, usually a letter to the Provincial Court Criminal Division, or withdraw the charges, usually done in open court by bringing the matter forward and withdrawing the charge with the accused consent. To my knowledge, Alberta Health Service, AHS, is not prosecuting any of the prosecutions before the court, either in-house counsel or hired external counsel. The matter that were initiated and pursued by AHS have either concluded or been discontinued by AHS itself. For example, AHS did commence civil contempt proceedings against Christopher Scott and Pastor Arthur and David Pulowski, but those concluded in the Pulowski's favor at the Court of Appeal this summer. I am not presently aware of any matter before the court being prosecuted by the AHS, but the Premier's office could confirm this easily through the Office of the Minister of Health, who can make the appropriate inquiries to the AHS in-house legal department. From what I have... Oh, Freddie just knocked over the garbage. Oh, Dr. G's gonna have to get on that. Shit, where was I? There may be one matter prosecuted under the Quarantine Act, which would likely...
It should come as no surprise that the CBC is coming to throw mud at Rebel News and me. They are Justin Trudeau's state broadcaster. They are his attack dogs, and they hate nothing more than Rebel News and the people who support us.
As to how exactly those conversations made their way to the Attorney General and exactly what he was up against, which, as we now know, people who are familiar with what happened are calling inappropriate pressure from the Premier.
Elise, how has the Premier responded?
She has made some public statements to the effect that she did speak with her Justice Minister and with his Deputy Attorney General about these matters. We know that she's come out and said that. What we didn't know before was, of course, the nature and how the office receiving that conversation had characterized it. So in response, the Premier said, you know, I have been clear that I have had these conversations. When I came into office, I wanted to take a look at what might be done legally to potentially grant amnesty to people with COVID-related offenses. In the end, she ended up dropping that promise and said it wasn't possible. But she said, look, everything that I have done here has gone through the appropriate channels and has been above board. She also harkened back in a later statement, a separate statement also issued today, talked about some reporting that we had done last week where we had been told that someone in her office had contacted Crown prosecutors related to Coote's border blockade criminal charges, and she's now calling that story defamatory. So there's a couple of new things from her office here as it comes to questions that swirl about the appropriateness of her interactions with people dealing with, both her Attorney General and Crown prosecutors, dealing with these COVID-related charges. Katie.
Elise Von Scheel, we will continue to follow this breaking and developing story. Thank you for your time today.
Premier's office calls for apology, retraction of CBC story alleging contact with Crown prosecutors. Here we have January 25th, 2023. Okay, so we're seeing the CBC propaganda story, false allegations with sources that they never named. And so now Danielle Smith is in rebuttal to that. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is calling on CBC News to retract and apologize for a story that cites unnamed sources alleging her office emailed Crown prosecutors regarding the handling of cases tied to last year's Coote's border blockade. In a statement Wednesday, Smith's office referred to CBC reporting in a story published January 19th, defamatory and containing baseless allegations. The Premier calls on the CBC to retract its outrageous story and further that CBC and the official opposition apologize to the Premier's office, staff, Alberta Crown prosecutors, and those in the Alberta Public Service for the damage caused to their reputation and that of Alberta's justice system, the statement reads. Smith goes on to note the CBC has amended its story to clarify that it had not seen any emails between her office and prosecutors. The CBC allegations and insinuations to the contrary are once again baseless. According to its journalistic standards and practice, CBC's stories are required to be based on information we have verified and first-hand identifiable sources.
So the people who we spoke to who were familiar with what went on, with what had been said and spoken about, called it inappropriate. They called it constant and consistent pressure, and that was what the Attorney General was dealing with.
We never should have come down on pastors the way we did. Every other jurisdiction, it seems, were able to enforce their measures without putting pastors in jail, and it's created so much division in our communities. So yes, we should drop those. We should also drop charges against small businesses. Part of the reason why we're enjoying the freedoms that we have today and the ability to go and watch hockey games is because there were some courageous people who stood up and said, you know what, there's another way to do this. Enough is enough. It took the politicians a little while longer to realize that. But now that they've realized that, I think part of the healing process is to make sure that some of those charges are dropped. The other thing we need to do, though, is we need to have a full reckoning about what happened, who made the decisions, why they made the decisions that they did.
Great question and a great answer. It became part of her campaign platform. And right then, the CBC resolved that they would do anything in their power to destroy Danielle Smith, but they failed. She is now the Premier of Alberta, but the CBC knows they'll get another chance just 4 months from now in the general election, so they are campaigning against her full tilt. Anyways, it looks like Smith is serious about keeping her promise to call off these very political lockdown prosecutions. Here's Smith confirming her position when our reporter Selena Glass asked her about it in November.
During your campaign, you said that not only would you issue an apology to those prosecuted during COVID restrictions, but you would also grant them amnesty. When can we expect those apologies?
I can apologize right now. I'm deeply sorry for anyone who was inappropriately subjected to discrimination as a result of their vaccine status. I'm deeply sorry for any government employee that was fired from their job because of their vaccine status. And I welcome them back if they want to come back. As for the amnesty, I have to get some legal advice on that. And so I've already asked my staff to request that advice so I can see how we would be able to proceed on that. My view has been that these were political decisions that were made, and so I think that they can be political decisions to offer a reversal. But I do want to get some legal advice on that first.
Would that also have to do with the timeline for the proposed amnesties?
I would have to see if I can do it, I will do it at the earliest opportunity. So I'm hoping within the next week I'll get that legal advice.
I have been telling you I grew up in Poland And in 1980, Polish people got angry. And I saw the police officers running for their lives. The very people that were enslaving the population, the very people that were doing this great evil to Poles were on the run. They were so terrified. I will never forget that. Because there is more of us than of them, and they crossed the line. If I was a politician, I would either resign now while you still can, because we're coming after you. And I'm not talking about the guns and the swords. I'm talking about justice. Real judges, real courts, the court of the people. Just like it was done under the Solidarity movement in Poland. And you got a second option. You can come to our side and you can tell the public what's really going on. You can come clean. You still have that time. You devils, if you're watching this, you snakes, it's still a time for you to come to the right side of the fence. Because when the people get angry, and they eventually will, when they will lose their children or their loved ones, their mothers, their fathers, and they will learn what really happened, I wouldn't want to be you. I wouldn't want to be you. So come clean, come out, join the fight against tyranny that you helped to build, or else. And or else is not going to be pretty. Because you may come and say, hey, mandates are over, restrictions are over, but we remember, we know who you are, we know your names, and 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when we get the power, or a year from now, we will come after you.
Well, there you have it, guys. We're wrapping up this story on Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith and Ezra from Rebel News. Let's finish off with the comments on the very CBC story that is propagated and also false, zero evidence of sources. So let's get into the comments, and I'll show you the Charter of Rights and Freedoms right now real quick. You are allowed to have protests in parks, etc. I'll read it out. Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 2C, includes the right to participate in peaceful demonstrations, protests, parades, meetings, picketing, and other assemblies. It protects the right to demonstrate on public streets. The freedom also extends to protecting the right to camp in a public park as part of protest activities and the ability to wear masks during a peaceful demonstration. However, it does not protect a particular venue for assembly. Also, if you want to read the rest of Ezra's letter, I'll make a separate video and link it below. I've only read, say, like 20% of it, so go check it out. It's in the description.
From Alberta, CBC News has learned Premier Danielle Smith pressured the Attorney General and his office to
Okay, guys, so let's take a look at the comments. On CBC's news, they usually turn off the comments. There's 454 comments. Okay, and this is 46 minutes ago from newest comments. Let's go right in the middle. This has been investigated and proven false. Is this the same type of pressure that was put on Commissioner Lucky for the release of the weapons used in the mass shooting in Nova Scotia? Just wondering. More CBC sources, laugh out loud. Sounds like the same sources that says vaccines were safe and effective. Holy, this woman gains weight per clip. Trudeau funded media CBC, timing priceless. As no secret Danielle Smith is against Trudeau. I think it's been proven that it's all a lie and no sound proof. Another multiple sources. When will CBC get off Smith's back? The last report related to this was proven lie, and now here it is again. This story has been debunked. CBC should apologize for fabricating lies. Unlike Trudeau's adventure and canning of JWR, these accusations were actually proven to be false, correct? CBC state propaganda, no different than North Korea's state propaganda. CBC, Canada's propaganda machine, totally funded by the worst prime minister in Canadian history. CBC is just awful. So this has been proven false. How can you live with yourself? Why is Jessica Yaniv on CBC? The Premier is seeking justice and freedom for all Canadians, The whiny crybaby Trudeau's cabinet and NDP Yegmit-Seen want more control over Canadians. P.S. Don't buy electric cars. So easy for Trudeau to switch off the power, and don't give up your guns. So let me just enter here my own opinion. So as you see, the comments are so far, everybody is against the CBC's propaganda and this story, and the consensus is this is proven false. Of course, I showed you earlier the footage, the story about Danielle Smith asking for them for apology and retraction, as that was a smear story. Let's continue with the comments from Cam. This sounds kind of corrupt. Scamdemic. BS again. No one listens to you anymore. You have lied to all of us. The time and work for the Liberals and the NDP, which are not at all for the people and only their negative agenda. Go away, CBC. You are prostitutes of the media. Oh, this is a long one. I hate when people just type in cap locks. Let's skip it. I have been embroiled in the US GOP Team Trump. It appears the Alberta Premier may be Republican. Jesus, help us. Next. CBC didn't report like this when Trudeau interfered with the SNC Lavalin bombshell Project Veritas on YouTube. Real journalism. The UK just banned the booster for 50-year-olds and younger. Mainstream media activists guilty. Why is this crap still posted? Wow, the Liberals have their own news delivering propaganda. The CBC National Enquirer at it again. Reliable sources have said this time and time again. Sickening that a Canadian news station has stopped to such low levels. Stooped. The truth has always been revealed, and this is an outright lie. Again, this was already proven false. Give it up. In politics, no one like her putting their people first. In politics, no one like her putting their people first. Are you incompetent and corrupt, CBC? I should get Smitty to fix my speeding ticket. So now, after investigation into this has found no emails about this exist, I guess we can come to the conclusion that once again the CBC has failed the Canadian public with more disinformation. Trudeau's propaganda mouthpiece, the CBC, has done it again to fund the CBC. Anyways, we could go on this forever. There's a few comments against Danielle Smith for obviously people unknowing or whatever, but yeah, thanks for watching.
They are Justin Trudeau's state broadcaster. They are his attack dogs, and they hate nothing more than rebel news and the people who support us. They follow Justin Trudeau's lead.
Quite frankly, I won't call it a media organization, your group of individuals need to take accountability for some of the polarization that we're seeing in this country. And I think Canadians are cluing into the fact that there is a really important decision we take about the kind of country we want to see. And I salute all extraordinary, hardworking journalists that put science and facts at the heart of what they do and ask me tough questions every day, but make sure that they are educating and informing Canadians from a broad range of perspectives, which is the last thing that you guys do.
The CBC obeys Trudeau and copies him, so they smear us and they attack us. They're part of the parliamentary press gallery that has illegally voted to block our reporters from attending press conferences in Ottawa.
And if the public has now come to terms with wanting a different approach, is it in the public interest? It's becoming increasingly hard to answer those two questions. Now, I put it to the prosecutors, and I've asked them to do a review of the cases with those two things in mind.
Smith was very careful with her words, wasn't she? She said she wasn't going to interfere with any prosecutions. That's what Justin Trudeau did to save his corrupt friends at SNC Lavalin. But Smith would follow the rules and just have a look at cases to make sure they were legally appropriate, especially since the province was losing so many of those cases in court. Were they really in the public interest to pursue? Did they really have a chance of conviction? Well, the government journalists at Trudeau's CBC state broadcaster couldn't stand that. And they hunted and hunted for proof that someone did something wrong. They showed a passion for this story that they never showed for Trudeau's interference with the SNC Lavalin case. And huge scoop, they found the smoking gun. Here's the blockbuster story that Megan, the CBC liar, published last week. Let me show it to you on Twitter. New. Alberta Premier's office contacted Crown prosecution about Coutts cases. Sources. Coutts is some of the trucker cases. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but more than 500,000 people read that tweet. And if you click on it, it leads to this story that is still up on the CBC website right now. Alberta Premier's office contacted Crown prosecution about Coutts cases. Sources. Now I'll read just a little bit from the story. A staffer in Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's office sent a series of emails to the Alberta Crown Prosecution Service challenging prosecutors' assessment and direction on cases stemming from the Coutts border blockades and protests, CBC News has learned. The emails were sent last fall, according to sources whom CBC has agreed not to identify because they fear they could lose their jobs. Wow, that is a bombshell. That's amazing investigative journalism. It's a smoking gun. In fact, it was so devastating it caused an emergency caucus meeting in Alberta. Smith's MLAs were in open revolt. Except it wasn't true. There were no such emails. And the CBC didn't admit until days later that they actually never saw any such emails. They didn't disclose that in their original story because they're not real journalists. They're government journalists. That's a very different thing you have to understand. They work for Trudeau. But because of that false accusation, the Public Service of Alberta, the nonpartisan permanent staff of the government, they had an emergency search of every single email between the Premier's entire staff and the Justice Department. They literally reviewed 1 million emails. And there wasn't a single one. Not one. Here's a CBC story grudgingly admitting that. Nearly a week after their smear was first published. You can see this was written by a different CBC reporter. Megan Grant is still lying about things. Her lie is still being published, both the tweet and the story that I showed you. They're still up. All they've done is added this little note to it. They say, editor's note. The original version of this story, published January 19th, neglected to note that CBC News has not seen the emails in question. Seriously, they left that out? They didn't mention that when they first made the accusation?